The first time she looked at me, it felt like the entire room forgot my name. I didn't move when the crowd erupted around the premiere, cameras flashing like artificial lightning across the red carpet, because there was a moment, just one, that didn't belong to anyone else. Olivia Harper stood under the glow of 100 cameras, the kind of presence people spent years trying to manufacture and never quite achieved, yet her eyes weren't on them. They were on me. I wasn't supposed to be anything more than background noise that night, just another photographer assigned to capture angles, smiles, and carefully curated moments, but something shifted when I raised my camera and framed her through the lens. She didn't smile for the cameras at first, not in the practiced way she usually did. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if she was trying to understand why I wasn't looking at her like everyone else was. I lowered the camera for a split second, unsure if I had crossed some invisible boundary, and that was when it happened. She didn't look away. Most people did, even her closest collaborators, even the journalists who claimed they understood her story. But Olivia's gaze stayed, steady and unblinking, like she was studying something she couldn't quite categorize. "Keep going," someone behind me whispered, unaware that everything had already changed. I lifted the camera again, but the shot no longer felt like work. It felt like a line had been drawn between two worlds, hers and mine, and I had somehow stepped into the space in between without permission. Later, when the noise of the premiere faded into distant echoes and Olivia moved through interviews like a perfectly written script, I found myself still thinking about that single moment, the way her expression had softened for half a second, as if the version of her the world knew had slipped just slightly out of frame. I told myself it meant nothing, that people like her didn't notice people like me, not in any meaningful way. But as I checked my camera's memory card under the dim backstage lights, I saw the image I hadn't meant to capture, her eyes not facing the crowd, not facing the cameras, but facing me as if I were the only thing in focus. The next morning did not feel like a continuation of the premiere night. It felt like an echo that refused to fade. Olivia Harper was already inside a glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the studio lot, reviewing schedules that stretched across the next 3 months, her assistant speaking in careful, measured sentences about interviews, promotional shoots, and brand obligations, but Olivia was only half listening. Every few minutes her attention drifted back to a single detail she could not logically justify, the photographer who had stood just outside the line of everything important and somehow made it feel like she was the only thing inside it. She told herself it was nothing unusual, just another person doing their job, just another face in a crowd of professionals who came and went through her life like background noise, yet the memory of that steady gaze kept interrupting her focus in a way she did not appreciate. By midday, she was on set for a controlled promotional shoot, surrounded by lighting rigs and stylists adjusting every detail of her appearance, and still she found herself scanning the edges of the room, without meaning to. That was when she saw her again. Emma Carter was not supposed to be there, not for this part of the schedule, yet she stood near the equipment crates reviewing her camera settings with quiet precision, completely absorbed in her work as if she did not notice the shift in Olivia's attention across the room. Olivia's assistant began speaking again, but the words faded into the background as Olivia's focus narrowed. Emma lifted her camera briefly, tested a shot, then lowered it, making a small adjustment as though nothing in the room carried any particular weight beyond exposure and composition. Olivia found herself watching longer than necessary, not because she wanted to be seen, but because she could not understand why being seen by Emma felt different from being seen by anyone else. Later, during a pause in filming, Olivia walked past the edge of the set under the pretense of checking lighting angles, and their paths crossed for less than 10 seconds. It should have been insignificant, just a passing moment between professional roles, but Emma looked up at exactly the wrong time, or perhaps the right one, and there it was again, that steady recognition that did not ask for permission. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between them did not feel empty, it felt structured, as if something unspoken had already begun taking shape in the space neither of them had agreed to enter. Olivia eventually broke eye contact first, telling herself it was intentional, controlled, professional. Yet as she returned to set, she realized she had memorized the exact angle of Emma's expression without meaning to. Olivia Harper spent the remainder of the afternoon convincing herself that the day had already peaked and everything after was simply repetition. The set had shifted into a controlled rhythm again, lighting adjustments, camera checks, brief interruptions of dialogue rehearsals, yet none of it fully registered in the way it normally would. She was used to commanding attention without effort, used to environments that bent around her presence, but today there was a quiet disruption she could not name. Every time she glanced toward the equipment area, Emma Carter was there, moving with quiet intent, adjusting lenses, reviewing shots, completely unaffected by the hierarchy of the room. It was not defiance that unsettled Olivia, it was consistency. Emma did not look at her like a celebrity, did not look away like a subordinate. She simply looked as if Olivia existed on the same level as everything else worth observing. At one point, during a pause in filming, Olivia overheard a producer mention that Emma's work had been specifically requested for additional coverage over the next several days due to a shift in promotional strategy. The words should have been irrelevant, but they settled into Olivia's awareness with unexpected weight. That meant more time, more proximity, more opportunities for this strange awareness to continue without interruption. Later, while Olivia sat in her chair between takes, a stylist adjusting lighting on her face, she caught Emma reviewing a series of captured images on her camera screen just a few feet away. Without meaning to, Olivia found herself watching Emma more than the monitor in front of her. Emma paused, sensed the attention, and looked up. There was no hesitation in her expression, only a calm acknowledgement that the moment had been noticed on both sides. Olivia turned her gaze forward immediately, but the timing had already betrayed her. The assistant called for the next setup, breaking the stillness, and Olivia stood, stepping back into position under the lights. Yet as she resumed her role, she became aware of something subtle shifting in her internal rhythm, not distraction exactly, but recognition of attention she had not initiated and could not fully control. When filming wrapped for the day, the studio began to empty in stages, leaving behind the hum of equipment powering down and the echo of footsteps across concrete floors. Olivia was preparing to leave when her assistant informed her that the director wanted Emma retained for additional behind-the-scenes material during tomorrow's private rehearsal session. The sentence was delivered casually, as routine scheduling, but Olivia felt it land differently than intended. It was not the schedule itself that mattered, it was the certainty that the pattern was continuing without her input. As she exited the studio and stepped into the warm evening air of Los Angeles, Olivia realized she was not thinking about the cameras, the script, or the production at all. She was thinking about the way Emma Carter had looked at her without asking permission, and how unfamiliar it felt to be noticed in a way that did not disappear when the lights turned off. The following morning arrived in Los Angeles with a soft gray light that made the city feel quieter than it truly was, as if the entire world was holding its breath before the day began. Olivia Harper was already awake long before her scheduled call time, sitting near the wide window of her penthouse apartment, watching traffic move like distant currents below. She had told herself she would not think about the previous day, that everything was part of routine production cycles and nothing more, yet her mind continued returning to small, uninvited fragments of memory. The way someone could look at her without adjusting their expression to match expectation. The way silence could feel directed rather than empty. She checked her phone twice, not expecting anything, then set it down again, as if it had interrupted something important. By mid-morning, she arrived at the studio earlier than required, something her assistant noticed, but did not comment on. The rehearsal space had been rearranged for blocking tests, with temporary lighting rigs and marked positions taped onto the floor. Crew members moved with familiar efficiency, yet Olivia found her attention drifting toward the entrance, more often than necessary. When Emma Carter finally arrived, there was no dramatic entrance, no shift in atmosphere that anyone else seemed to notice. She carried her camera bag over one shoulder, reviewed her checklist briefly, and began setting up without hesitation. Olivia observed this from a distance at first, telling herself she was assessing logistics, yet the explanation felt increasingly unconvincing. During the rehearsal, Olivia delivered lines she had performed countless times before, but something about the process felt subtly altered. It was not the scene itself, It was the awareness that someone was documenting it differently than everyone else. Emma did not interrupt, did not interfere, but there was a consistency to her presence that made it impossible to ignore. Between takes, Olivia noticed Emma reviewing images on her camera screen, occasionally adjusting settings with calm precision. At one point, Olivia found herself walking closer than necessary to retrieve a marked position on the floor, and their proximity narrowed briefly in a way that should have meant nothing. Emma glanced up, not startled, not surprised, simply attentive, as if she had already registered Olivia's approach before it happened. Olivia paused for half a second longer than intended before continuing forward, aware that the moment had no official purpose, yet still felt recorded in some unspoken way. Later, during a scheduled break, Olivia's assistant mentioned that the production team was considering expanding behind the scenes documentation for upcoming press materials, with Emma remaining attached to the project for continuity. The explanation was practical, industry standard, and yet Olivia found herself listening more carefully than she expected. As the day continued, she noticed that her attention no longer moved away from Emma as easily as before. It did not feel like distraction in the usual sense, but rather an awareness that persisted even when she tried to redirect it. When filming concluded for the day, Olivia lingered longer than necessary near the exit corridor, watching crew members disperse equipment and shut down lights. Emma remained until the end, organizing her materials with methodical care before slinging her bag over her shoulder. For a brief moment, as the studio emptied around them, Olivia realized there were no cameras actively rolling, no scripted dialogue, no external reason for their awareness to intersect, and yet it still did. Emma looked up once before leaving, and Olivia held her gaze for just long enough to understand that whatever pattern had begun was continuing without instruction from either of them. The studio lot was already shifting into evening mode when Olivia Harper arrived the next day, with the kind of controlled quiet that always followed long production cycles. Equipment cases were stacked along the walls, lighting rigs partially dismantled, and crew members moved with the relaxed efficiency of people who had repeated the same workflow hundreds of times. Olivia walked through it all with practiced focus, yet something subtle in her awareness felt different, as if her attention was no longer fully directed by routine alone. Emma Carter was already there. She was positioned near the main rehearsal stage, adjusting her camera strap while reviewing a small notebook of planned shots. There was no dramatic pause, no acknowledgement that anything had changed between them since the last day, yet Olivia noticed herself registering Emma's presence earlier than necessary, before any professional reason required it. During blocking rehearsals, Olivia performed her scenes with precision, delivering lines into empty space marked by tape on the floor and lighting cues overhead. The director's voice echoed through the studio, calling adjustments, resetting positions, and guiding timing, but Olivia's attention occasionally drifted toward the side of the room where Emma worked quietly. Emma moved with deliberate care, never intruding, never interrupting, yet always positioned in a way that allowed observation without interference. At one point, Olivia heard a crew member mention that a short documentary segment would be added to the promotional package, capturing behind-the-scenes footage over multiple days. The detail was procedural, nothing unusual for productions of this scale, yet Olivia found herself paying closer attention than she intended. Later, during a pause between rehearsal runs, Olivia stepped off set to review notes with her assistant. As she stood near a lighting marker on the floor, she realized Emma was only a few steps away, adjusting camera settings while reviewing the last sequence filmed. The proximity was accidental in appearance, but neither of them moved immediately. Olivia noticed the absence of urgency in Emma's posture, the way she seemed fully absorbed in observation rather than reaction. When Emma finally looked up, it was not abrupt or surprised, but steady, as if the moment had already been acknowledged internally before it occurred externally. Olivia responded by shifting her focus back toward the set, yet she remained aware that the exchange had been registered on both sides, without verbal confirmation. As the rehearsal continued, Olivia became increasingly conscious of how often her attention returned to the same point in the room, even when she attempted to redirect it elsewhere. It was not disruption in the traditional sense, but persistence, an awareness that did not fade with instruction or distraction. By the time filming wrapped for the day, the studio had transitioned into its end cycle, lights dimming and equipment being rolled into storage positions. Olivia remained longer than necessary near the edge of the stage, observing the final crew members finishing their tasks. Emma was among the last to leave, securing her equipment with careful, practiced movements before stepping toward the exit. For a brief moment, as the space emptied and the noise faded, Olivia realized there were no remaining external requirements forcing their awareness into the same frame, and yet it still persisted. Emma glanced back once before leaving, and Olivia did not immediately look away, recognizing without fully articulating it that whatever had begun between them was continuing forward without instruction, schedule, or permission. By the next afternoon, Los Angeles had settled into a bright, almost indifferent calm, the kind of sunlight that made everything look sharper without making anything feel clearer. Olivia Harper arrived at the studio earlier than scheduled, moving through the entrance with a quiet focus that her assistant immediately noticed, but did not question. The production space was already active, with crew members preparing for a full rehearsal cycle that would run longer than previous days, adjusting lighting rigs and marking new positions across the stage floor. Olivia moved through it all with her usual precision, yet there was a subtle difference in how she observed the room, as if her awareness was no longer limited to only what was necessary for performance. Emma Carter was already inside when Olivia entered the main stage area. She stood near a cluster of equipment cases, reviewing her camera settings and checking exposure levels on a handheld monitor. There was nothing performative in her presence, nothing that suggested awareness of hierarchy or expectation, and yet Olivia found herself registering Emma's position almost immediately upon entering the space. During rehearsal setup, the director called for final adjustments and Olivia stepped into position under the stage lighting. The scene required repetition of a dialogue sequence she had performed many times before, yet today she found her attention divided in a way that was difficult to ignore. Emma moved along the perimeter of the set, documenting angles and testing frames without interfering, but Olivia became increasingly aware of how consistently Emma remained within her field of perception. At one point, while a lighting technician adjusted a key spotlight overhead, Olivia glanced toward the side of the stage and saw Emma briefly pause her work, as if evaluating a composition that included more than just the subject in front of her lens. The moment was brief, almost negligible in duration, but it registered with unusual clarity. Later, during a scheduled reset, Olivia stepped off mark and walked toward her designated waiting area. Emma happened to be reviewing captured footage on a small screen mounted to her camera rig. Their proximity was unplanned, yet neither of them immediately adjusted position. Olivia noticed that Emma did not look startled or reactive, but instead maintained a steady awareness that felt consistent rather than situational. The exchange lasted only a few seconds before Olivia shifted her attention back toward the stage instructions, yet she became aware that the moment had already been internally recorded in a way that did not require acknowledgement to persist. As rehearsal continued, Olivia found herself increasingly aware of intervals where her attention drifted toward the same part of the room without conscious decision. It was not interruption in the traditional sense, but continuity, as if certain observations were repeating themselves beneath the surface of routine activity. The production team proceeded with schedule adjustments, running through blocking changes and timing corrections, while Emma remained positioned at the edge of the set, moving only when necessary to capture planned sequences. By late afternoon, the studio lighting had shifted to a warmer tone as natural daylight began filtering through high windows, signaling the gradual transition toward the end of the working cycle. Equipment began to power down in sections, and crew members started organizing gear for storage. Olivia remained on set longer than required, reviewing final notes with her assistant while observing the gradual clearing of the space. Emma was among the last to remain, carefully securing her equipment and reviewing the final captured frames before preparing to leave. For a brief moment, the studio felt structurally empty despite the presence of remaining personnel, as if the functional purpose of the space had temporarily paused. Olivia and Emma were once again within visual range of each other, without production necessity. Emma glanced up briefly before turning toward the exit, and Olivia did not immediately break her line of sight, recognizing that the pattern between them had continued to develop without instruction, explanation, or interruption from the external world. The following day began differently, not in structure or schedule, but in atmosphere, as if something unspoken had begun influencing the rhythm of everything around Olivia Harper. She arrived at the studio earlier than usual, passing through the main gate before most of the crew had fully assembled, her presence acknowledged with polite efficiency, but no disruption to the routine of production. Inside the soundstage, equipment was already being arranged for a longer rehearsal sequence, with updated lighting configurations and expanded camera coverage intended for promotional material. Olivia moved through it with practiced familiarity, yet her attention no longer settled exclusively on the technical aspects of the environment. Emma Carter was already present near the far side of the set, reviewing a sequence of captured images on a portable screen, her posture calm and deliberate, as if she had arrived in sync with a schedule that required no confirmation. Olivia noticed her presence earlier than necessary, before any logical reason would require awareness, and continued forward as though nothing had changed, though something clearly had. During rehearsal, the director called for a full run of a key emotional scene, and Olivia took her position under the main lighting array. The script unfolded as expected, with cues delivered from off-camera and timing adjusted through subtle direction from the crew, yet Olivia became increasingly aware of how her attention occasionally drifted toward the edge of the set where Emma stood. Emma did not move in ways that demanded attention, but rather in ways that made absence noticeable when she paused. Between takes, Olivia stepped briefly off mark to review direction notes with her assistant, and during that interval, Emma adjusted her position slightly to capture a different angle of the set lighting. The movement was minimal, but Olivia found herself tracking it without conscious intention. At one point, as Olivia waited for a lighting adjustment to be completed, she turned her head and realized Emma was already looking in her direction. There was no visible reaction from either side, no acknowledgement beyond the brief alignment of attention, yet the moment held longer internally than it did externally. Olivia returned her focus to the stage instructions, but the awareness did not fully disengage, as if it had settled into a quieter layer beneath routine observation. As the rehearsal progressed, the studio shifted through multiple setups, resetting positions and adjusting camera placements for different angles of the same scene. Crew members moved with increasing efficiency as the day advanced, their voices blending into a controlled background rhythm of production coordination. Emma remained positioned at the perimeter of activity, documenting each sequence with consistent precision, never interrupting the flow of filming, yet always present within its visual boundaries. By late afternoon, the lighting transitioned gradually from artificial intensity to a softer blend of natural illumination filtering through the high studio windows, signaling the final stages of the scheduled rehearsal cycle. Equipment began to power down in sections, and movement across the set slowed as tasks were completed and checked off. Olivia remained on set longer than required, reviewing final adjustments with her assistant while observing the gradual clearing of space around her. Emma continued working until the end, securing her equipment and reviewing final captures before preparing to leave with the remaining crew. For a brief interval, the studio existed in a transitional state between full activity and complete emptiness, where sound diminished and spatial awareness became more pronounced. Olivia found herself positioned near the edge of the stage as Emma passed within visual range, both of them no longer bound by active production cues. Emma looked up briefly as she moved toward the exit, and Olivia held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, recognizing without needing confirmation that whatever pattern had formed between them had now become a consistent presence that no longer depended on coincidence or schedule to continue. The studio felt different when Olivia Harper arrived the next morning, not because anything visible had changed, but because something in her perception had begun to shift in ways she could not fully explain. The space still carried the same controlled energy of a working production environment, with crew members setting up lighting rigs, adjusting camera rails, and reviewing schedules for the day's rehearsal sequence, yet Olivia noticed details she would normally overlook. She arrived earlier than required, as she had begun doing without conscious reasoning, and walked through the entrance with a sense of familiarity that felt increasingly layered with anticipation rather than routine. Emma Carter was already inside the soundstage when Olivia entered. She stood near the central camera setup, reviewing a sequence of captured frames on her device, her posture steady and composed, as if she had never arrived late or early, only exactly when needed. Olivia registered her presence immediately, earlier than she intended to, and continued walking as though it meant nothing, although it clearly did. During the morning rehearsal, the director called for a full emotional sequence that required multiple resets, adjusting lighting temperature and camera distance to capture subtle variations in performance. Olivia delivered her lines with precision, her focus trained on continuity and timing, yet she became increasingly aware that her attention was no longer contained strictly within the performance itself. Emma moved along the edge of the set with quiet consistency, documenting each run-through without interrupting, yet somehow maintaining a presence that Olivia could not fully filter out. Between takes, Olivia stepped away to review adjustments with her assistant, and during that interval, Emma repositioned slightly closer to the main stage area to capture a different angle. The movement was minimal, yet Olivia found herself tracking it without intention, as if her awareness had begun prioritizing certain details without permission. At one point, while lighting technicians recalibrated overhead intensity, Olivia turned her head briefly and found Emma already looking in her direction. There was no visible reaction from either of them, no acknowledgement beyond the shared awareness of being observed, yet the moment felt structurally complete in a way that lingered longer than its actual duration. Olivia shifted her focus back to the rehearsal, but the sensation of being aware of Emma did not fade as quickly as before. It remained present in the background of every action, like an unresolved thread woven through otherwise structured routine. As the day progressed, the production continued through multiple scene adjustments, with crew members refining blocking positions and camera angles for final coverage. The studio environment maintained its professional rhythm, yet Olivia noticed that her attention no longer moved exclusively in response to direction or necessity. It moved with memory of observation, as if anticipating patterns that had not yet occurred. By late afternoon, the studio lighting softened as external daylight filtered through the upper windows, signaling the gradual transition toward the end of the working cycle. Equipment was powered down in stages, and the set began to empty with controlled efficiency. Olivia remained on set longer than required, reviewing final notes with her assistant while observing the gradual reduction of activity around her. Emma stayed until the final phase as well, carefully securing her equipment and reviewing the last captured sequences before preparing to leave with the remaining crew. For a brief period, the studio existed in a quiet transitional state where movement slowed and sound diminished, leaving only spatial awareness and residual presence. Olivia found herself near the edge of the stage as Emma passed within visual range, both no longer held by active production requirements. Emma glanced up briefly as she moved toward the exit, and Olivia did not immediately break her line of sight, recognizing with growing clarity that whatever had developed between them was no longer a sequence of coincidental moments, but a continuous pattern that persisted even in silence. The final day of the rehearsal cycle began with a stillness that felt heavier than the previous days, as if the entire production space had settled into a moment of quiet anticipation before completion. Olivia Harper arrived at the studio slightly earlier than usual, passing through the main entrance with the same controlled pace she had maintained throughout the week, though now it carried a subtle difference she could no longer ignore. The environment inside was familiar, with crew members dismantling temporary setups, reviewing final notes, and preparing equipment for storage, yet Olivia's awareness seemed tuned to details that previously would not have registered. Emma Carter was already present near the main stage when Olivia stepped into the soundstage. She stood in her usual position along the perimeter of activity, reviewing the last set of captured images on her device, her movements calm and unhurried, as if time itself followed a separate rhythm around her. Olivia noticed her immediately, not because she was visually prominent, but because her presence had become a fixed point of reference within the space. During the final rehearsal run, Olivia delivered her performance with precision, guided by the director's cues and the structured flow of production timing, yet something beneath the surface of routine had shifted. It was no longer a matter of noticing Emma occasionally, but of being continuously aware of where she was within the room. Emma moved through her documentation process with consistent discipline, adjusting framing angles and capturing transitional moments as the crew worked through final adjustments. There was no interruption in her behavior, no deviation from professional focus, yet Olivia found that this very consistency made her increasingly aware of her. Between takes, Olivia stepped off position briefly while lighting technicians adjusted final exposure levels across the stage. In that interval, Emma repositioned slightly closer to the central axis of the set, capturing a final sequence of rehearsal movement. Olivia became aware of this shift without needing to see it directly, as if her attention had begun mapping Emma's presence automatically. At one point, Olivia turned her head during a pause in direction and realized Emma was already looking toward her, not with urgency or surprise, but with steady recognition that required no explanation. The moment lasted only seconds before Olivia returned her focus to the stage instructions, yet it did not dissolve in the way previous moments had. It remained present, like a structural echo within her awareness. As the final rehearsal concluded, the studio entered its closing phase, with equipment being powered down and crew members transitioning into breakdown procedures. The space gradually lost its layered intensity, returning to a more neutral state of emptiness as production concluded. Olivia remained on set longer than necessary, standing near the edge of the stage while reviewing final notes with her assistant, observing the gradual disappearance of activity around her. Emma continued until the final clearance, carefully securing her equipment and completing her last checks before preparing to leave. The studio, now almost entirely cleared, felt different in a way that was not physical but perceptual, as if the absence of production had revealed something previously hidden beneath structure and noise. Olivia found herself positioned near the main exit corridor as Emma passed within visual range for what felt like the final time. Emma slowed slightly, not stopping, but enough for their awareness to intersect once more without interruption. There was no dialogue, no external cue, no requirement for acknowledgement, yet Olivia did not look away immediately. In that final shared moment before separation, she recognized that whatever had formed between them was no longer dependent on proximity or coincidence, but had become something that persisted even when everything else had ended.